Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and very much welcome to this first webinar in the two-part series. My name is Dr. Tom Clements, and I will be moderating this today. I was the original founder and director of the Forest and Climate Leaders Partnership, and I'm now the executive director at the Royal Foundation. Our focus today is on sovereign financial instruments and their potential for nature and sustainable development financing. Before we dive into the main topics and hear from our speakers and yourselves, just to give a brief outline of the objectives of the webinar and why we are here. The FCLP, the Forest and Climate Leaders Partnership, was launched by world leaders at COP27 and aims to accelerate global progress to halt and reverse forest loss and land degradation by 2030. And this was a original voluntary goal, which has now been recognized by the parties to the COP at COP28 through the UAE consensus. So all parties have recognized that this is a target that they should be working towards. The FCLP itself is a voluntary partnership of countries which contribute to this agenda through national action and international collaboration. As part of the international collaboration, FCLP members have committed to work on a number of policies and work streams. And one of these is on debt instruments and approaches for nature, which is led by the US and Colombia. And it aims to mobilize action to support the triple crisis of unsustainable debt burdens, escalating the costs of climate shocks and the transition, and the adverse economic impacts of climate change and biodiversity loss. The goal of this series of webinars is to discuss with experts what are some of the most innovative financial solutions available to address these three pressing issues, and the opportunities, challenges, and how governments and finance investors can engage on this agenda. We have an excellent lineup of speakers today who are each bringing their unique expertise and insights to the table. First, we'll hear from Paul Steele, who is the chief economist at IIED, the International Institute for Environment and Development. Paul will provide an introductory overview of sovereign financial instruments and their potential to drive investments in climate mitigation, biodiversity conservation, and sustainable development. And then after Paul, we will have a Q&A session where you'll have the opportunity to ask Paul questions and engage in a discussion. And please feel free to put these questions on the chat or to raise your hand so that we can come back to you. The second presentation will be led by Jill Dorchy, the founder and chief executive of Potomac Group, LLC. And Jill will dive into the key components and processes involved in issuing thematic bonds, loans, and other nature-related debt instruments. We'll conclude then with another Q&A period to allow for further discussion. I'm excited to facilitate this important conversation and look forward to hearing from our speakers engaging with all of you. So, Paul, I will pass over to you for the first presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom, and thanks for inviting me to join this important panel. I hope my slides can be projected. Are my slides able to be shared? Yeah. Okay, great. So I'm going to talk about debt instruments for climate and nature as Tom set out. And there you see the money tree. Hopefully we're going to be able to share with you how you can shake the money tree down and get access to some of the different money tied up in the tree to invest in climate and nature in your respective countries. Next slide, please. So just a quick outline of the presentation. As Tom said, I'll be talking in the context of the triple debt, climate and nature crisis and the need for a systemic and upscaled response. I'll set out what are the basic debt instruments for climate and nature, what are the basic approaches, and then give some explanations of what an SDG debt swap looks like and some examples. And then I'll give a diagram from a recent important World Bank and IMF paper of how the money for a swap or a transaction should be earmarked. And then I'm going to highlight the 7 steps of a debt, climate and nature deal, drawing from a publication that IIED put together with inputs from Jill and her colleagues at Potomac Group. Next slide, please. So this is as Tom called it, the triple crisis of debt, climate and nature. First of all, we see a growing number of countries, especially in Africa, and I'm sure you're only too conscious of this in your own countries, where more than 20 to 30% of government spending is going on debt interest, much more than is being spent on health and education combined, which leaves a combustible result for social unrest. We've seen the issues in Kenya now spreading to Uganda, Nigeria, and elsewhere. I mean, debt is not the only impact on the social unrest, but it's certainly a possible cause. The need for austerity measures in the face of needing to balance the books. That this means that there's no finance left for domestic investments in climate and nature, despite growing climate heat stress and climate disasters. I mean, climate heat stress is coming along, I think, much more as an impact than people realized maybe even 5 years ago. So in addition to short sudden shocks, we have the gradual impact on humans, particularly older people, of heat stress. Although there are climate investments going on to developing countries from developed countries, these are still often provided, particularly on the mitigation side, as loans, and those loans obviously only add to the debt burden. So there's a need for a systemic response to this debt crisis, which will tackle the debt crisis and the climate and nature crisis. But so far, we've only had a very piecemeal approach so far. We've had the common framework, which has had pretty slow, if any progress at all, and in many cases the transactions I'll talk about in terms of debt swaps have been fairly limited. So the question is, how can we upscale and get a more coherent response? Next slide, please. So what are the key debt instruments for climate and nature? Debt swaps or debt relief for old debt are where creditors agree that a debtor government can swap their debt principal and interest to instead be spent on climate and nature investments, such as post-flood disaster rehabilitation or renewable energy, and other fiscal needs such as health, education, and infrastructure. There's also instruments such as new debt swapping, where the old debt is swapped to generate new debt through bonds, including credit enhancements and insurance and risk guarantees linked to climate and nature key performance indicators. And then there are debt-related bonds, which can be of 2 kinds: general purpose, to create fiscal space for health infrastructure, as well as environmental key performance indicators, or earmarked bonds, which are also called use of proceeds bonds, which are green, blue, resilience, and sustainability linked bonds. So there's a whole slew of these different kind of use of proceeds bonds. But the latter instruments, I'm sure Jill will talk more about. So I'm going to focus more on the debt swap instruments, or the debt transactions. Next slide, please. So there are different approaches in terms of debt swaps, to the way the debt is handled, which creditors are focused on, which aspects of the environment are tackled, and how the funds flow. In terms of debt, it depends on whether the concern is relieving old debt versus rolling over to generate new debt in the form of some kind of new bond. In terms of creditors, there's variation depending on whether comprehensive approach is taken to creditors, including all public creditors as well as private creditors, including multilateral creditors as well as bilateral creditors such as China and so on, versus a focus more on one kind of creditor. In particular, some of the swaps that have taken place more recently have focused on private sector creditors. And then in terms of the environment, there's been variation as to whether there's general budget support with links to performance indicators or key performance indicators linked to national policy commitments versus specific environmental investments where you invest in a wind farm or a solar farm or whatever. And then finally, in terms of fund flow, there's variation in terms of special purpose earmarking vehicles versus use of proceeds, and how it goes into the national budget. And I'm going to talk a bit about that later on with the diagram. Next slide, please. So this is a diagram of one type of SDG or Sustainable Development Goal debt swap. So if you start with the debtor country on the top right-hand corner, which receives some debt relief based on pre-agreed key performance indicators to increase its fiscal space for general purpose spending such as health, education, as well as climate and nature investment. And this debt relief comes from multilateral creditors such as the IMF, the World Bank, ADB, and so on, as well as potential bilaterals such as China and the Paris Club, and then, of course, the private bondholders. And that allows the debtor to increase its national spending on these various areas, assuming that, and the funds can be channeled through the national budget, assuming there are appropriate fiduciary safeguards to implement climate and nature investments in the country. That those investments go towards indigenous people and local communities as guardians of nature, leading to local action, as well as obviously positive climate and nature outcomes. And then these are monitored by third party to achieve monitoring, verification, and reporting against the pre-agreed key performance indicators. So that's one possible scenario of an SDG swap. Next slide. So here are some examples of where these swaps have taken place. The first of these swaps was in Seychelles, $25 million odd in 2018 for fisheries, marine and tourism, and to some extent coastal resilience. Then in Belize and Barbados, we've had $200 million each in 2021, 2022, again for marine investments, and many of these were done by the Nature Conservancy, the big US NGO. I think Jill was involved in some, so she can also give her perspectives. Then there was an agreement more recently with Cape Verde, with Portugal as a large large creditor country to write off some of its debt. I think the slides have gone. You can bring them back. I've lost the slides. Victoria, yeah. So yeah, and then the other countries are now discussing these instruments, including Sri Lanka is discussing quite a large swap, possibly after it, once it sorts out its agreement with the IMF bailout Lao PDR is discussing. Egypt, I think, has had some kind of swap with China, and Kenya, before its recent troubles, was also discussing a swap. Next slide, please. So this is a slide from this recent interesting IMF and World Bank paper called Debt for Development Swaps and Approach Framework, which came out just a couple of months ago. And it shows how you have country systems on the left-hand side and the degree of earmarking on the right-hand side. So in terms of how much you want to manage the funds versus through kind of versus using country systems. So close to the offshore special purpose vehicle, the inside square is the kind of most cautious approach, where you've got a very little use of country systems. Then you go to international or local NGO, and then you can go to quite a lot of use of country systems and much softer earmarking. So that's the use of different approaches to earmarking, and different groups will have different views. I mean, I know the TNC typically prefers this use of a special purpose vehicle or a trust fund in country, although they do have government representatives on the trust fund. But where government would presumably, the debtor government would presumably prefer to have as much as possible use of country systems and more fiscal space and less earmarking. So I think there may be one. Oh, I think the last slide is a list of references. Oh, so sorry. No, one more slide before that. So doing a debt swap deal, 7 steps. So this is the drawing from this guidance that we put together with the Potomac group. 7 steps to put very practical guidance if you do want to undertake one of these in your own country. First of all, obviously, as with any government process which involves a number of interministerial agencies, you need to create some form of task force and agree on national objectives. Then you need to access your capacity building and advice, whether it's from NGOs or sovereign debt advisors or from multilaterals or whatever, but there's quite a lot of advice out there. You need to choose the type of sovereign debt transaction. You need to structure the climate and nature key performance indicators, often drawing from, in the case of climate, from your nationally determined contribution, and in the case of biodiversity, from your national biodiversity strategy and action plan. And then you need to design the financing aspects of the transaction, and then sixthly, engage with the market participants, obviously the creditors, as well as the credit rating agencies, as any of these deals will have an impact on access to the markets and the way the country is perceived in the markets. And then you need to execute the debt transaction with the communication strategy and lawyers and bankers and all the associated other groups involved providing the advice. And the final slide, as I think I said, is on references. So I've started with this recent World Bank IMF paper on debt swaps, which is quite interesting, as well as some other references from ourselves at IID, where we've been working on these deals for the last 2 or 3 years. So you can look at some of our material. But I'll stop there and open it up for discussion. Thanks very much.
Huge thanks, Paul. And that was very clear. I'd like to now pass over for questions to Paul. As a reminder, you can either please type your question in the chat or raise your hand, and when we will moderate the hand list as well. maybe while you're thinking about your questions, I'm going to take the liberty of asking a first one, Paul. There's obviously a lot of scope with these instruments. What are the barriers to scaling the use of these instruments? If more governments want to undertake any of these types of swap transactions, what are the sorts of enabling conditions that need to be put in place to bring these things to scale? Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, that question does get asked a lot. I mean, the challenge is, as I said at the beginning, it's been a bit piecemeal. So every time you start out as a country, you have to sort of start from scratch in lining up the arrangements with the creditors, agreeing the key performance indicators, putting together the outline of a deal. Whereas the common framework that exists for the sort of general debt discussions is a bit more overarching. So it would be nice if one of two things happened: either the common framework started to look at integrating climate or nature into the common framework in a more structured way, or there was a separate, more structured process for looking at these deals, so that each country didn't have to begin from scratch when it wanted to undertake one of these transactions. And there was a kind of a bit more of a cookie cutter approach. I mean, obviously each country is different, but there are certain things which are similar and could be drawn upon in similar ways.
Thank you, Paul. That's very clear. Does anyone else want to come in with a question for Paul?
Sorry, Tom, there is one question on the chat.
I've got an anonymous person here that says, what happens in the case that the KPIs are not reached? Do you have an answer to that, Paul?
Yeah, that is again a very good question, and I mean, maybe I would defer to Jill if she has any experience of that. I mean, that is one of the challenges with this, as with any debt agreement. If the creditor's not satisfied, then it can have repercussions. I mean, just in the same way, having a deal with the IMF, and if you don't reach any of your agreements with the IMF, it could have impacts on your payment schedule. So I don't see why it's any different from a vanilla type debt restructuring than it is for a climate and nature debt restructuring.
That makes sense, Paul. Thanks. Just a reminder to everybody that on Zoom, there is a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. And if you click that, you will be able to type your question into that chat function. So not to use the main chat of Zoom, but to use the Q&A button. There's a question from Carla Cardenas about what is the role of the NGOs participating? Are NGOs only restricted to roles around the US debt for nature swaps, or are NGOs involved in other debt refinancing transactions? Thanks, Paul.
No, I think we would say that NGOs have a very crucial role. I mean, particularly as IIED ourselves, we're an NGO, so we work a lot with NGOs in southern countries. I mean, they have roles throughout the process in helping to work with the government to identify what the key performance indicators should be. And I think that has been the case in some countries. They have roles in terms of helping to the government to implement the transaction and to implement the key performance indicators, whether it's setting up a marine protected area, identifying forests that need to be more sustainably managed. And then finally, NGOs have a role in kind of monitoring and holding the government to account for the key performance indicators. So I think NGOs are absolutely critical to this process. I mean, that's domestic NGOs, international NGOs like the Nature Conservancy and World Wildlife Fund and the Pew Charitable Trust, which are some of the international NGOs which have been involved in these transactions, also have a role providing kind of technical inputs onto how to negotiate and implement these transactions.
Thanks, Paul. It's very clear. If there are no more questions that people have asked, Jill, am I able to push? Oh, okay, we have one more. Are there any mechanisms that do not involve more debt, Paul? Can we repeat the question, Paul? The question is, are there mechanisms that do not involve countries taking on more?
So that's what I was trying to get across in my initial distinction. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Yeah, great. Okay. Between, the kind of transactions where you negotiate your old debt and there's debt relief based on that versus rolling that over and turning it into new debt through a bond. So the former is involving no new debt, and where the debt is relieved, and instead of making debt repayments, you use the money saved by investing it domestically in your own climate and nature domestic investments. So there doesn't have to. You can avoid any new debt. I mean that requires the creditors to be willing to make those sacrifices, if you like. I mean, particularly if it's private creditors, they may be a bit reluctant. The IMF seems to be more willing to use their resilience and sustainability trust fund and some of their other instruments towards these approaches. But the private sector may be less willing to do it without generating some form of new debt. I'm sure Jill will talk about that. But I'm just curious, before we move on, I mean, has anyone on the call had any experience themselves of these instruments, and what issues have they found, both positive and negative?
Thanks, Paul. That's a question back to the group. Maybe while people think about that, I'll pass, conscious of time, so I'll pass on to Jill for her presentation. I see more questions in the chat, and then what I'll do is we'll come back to the questions as they come in after you've presented, Jill. I hope that's okay. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you very much. While my slides are coming up, I just, by way of introduction, my name is Jill Doshi, and I'm the founder and CEO of Potomac Group, and we are an advisory firm based in Washington, D.C. And we work very closely with not only sovereign governments, but also with large international NGOs, multilaterals, and other stakeholders in these types of transactions. So I'm happy to take questions on both debt swaps and some of the issues that we'll talk about now. So we can turn to the first slide, please. So just by way of kind of summary and hopefully linking and clarifying a little bit about the different types of debt instruments in this space. We first have what we call the use of proceeds bonds, also referred to as thematic bonds. But in this type, these are bonds that are raising new money for a very specific task. So kind of like a project financing, but they have a very particular use of proceeds, as Paul mentioned, earmarked bonds. So in the first category, we have what we call green or blue bonds. These are bond instruments that can either be, well, they could be bonds or actually loans, wherein the proceeds will be exclusively applied to finance or refinance in full or in part existing projects or activities with the environmental impact. So for instance, that could include projects regarding renewable energy, energy efficiency, clean transportation, or climate change adaptation, but really looking at that kind of climate and nature focus. A next category that you will hear often are social bonds, or even what Paul also mentioned, SDG bonds. So social bonds are the same thing, that you're raising new money, but it is earmarked or used specifically to finance or refinance social projects. These are aimed normally at target populations, vulnerable either because of poverty levels or because of exposure to climate change or other social issues. Projects include food security, often socioeconomic advancement, and access to essential services. So again, really looking at raising money specifically for a social project purpose. And the creditors, again, will be, looking at those kind of end projects. The third category in this space is called sustainable, or what we call sustainability bonds. And these are bonds that, again, are use of proceeds bonds. So you've agreed with your creditors that you're raising new money for a specific purpose. But in the sustainable bond space, you're actually mixing both climate and nature goals and social goals. So this is a combination of the green bonds and the social bonds, and this category then would be called sustainable or sustainability bonds. Each of these processes are governed or kind of guided by some process guidelines. The International Capital Markets Authority, or ICMA, or ICMA, has set out very specific guidelines for green and blue bonds, as well as the European Union has a blue economy framework as well. Social bonds are also have guidelines set out by ICMA, and the sustainable bonds, again, where you mix both the green and the social, is also available online. And that gives a very good guidance on what types of projects and how to structure the activities that would be eligible under these categories. Next slide, please. And another category of new money instrument is what is called a sustainability-linked debt instrument. So that's not to be confused with the earlier sustainable bond, or just a general term of sustainable finance, but a sustainability-linked bond, or what is often referred to as an SLB, is a very particular type of instrument. And we're going to focus on this one because it is, I think, a very new and exciting innovation that's happening in the market. And I think this is something that will be increasingly attractive to potential investors as well as to the issuers. So the SLB is more for a general use of proceeds, so for general purposes of the sovereign issuer, but instead of having just to invest in a particular project, the issuer is saying, I'm going to use this money in the ways that I see appropriate, but I agree with you, my creditors, that I'm going to meet key performance indicators. that are going to be aligned with named sustainability performance targets. And we're going to go into this in more detail. So this will be a little bit more clear as we unpack what that really means. But just so you're aware that ICMA has also created SLB principles, and those are a selection of the key performance indicators, or KPIs, a calibration of sustainability performance targets, the actual bond characteristics in terms of its financials. Then there's the reporting on the progress towards the KPIs and the verification of a third party of that progress. Again, those are all kind of voluntary principles, but it helps issuers understand the process and to move forward with its advisors and bankers in structuring these types of instruments. So in general, I just, before we get into the details of SLBs, I also wanted to give, kind of put these in context. So the evolution of what we call the GSS plus, or the Green, Social, and Sustainability plus capital markets has been growing substantially. These graphs have been taken from a very good report by the Climate Bonds Initiative. It was done in late last year of 2023. I think they're coming out with an update soon. But just to show the growth is quite impressive. And this is all GSS plus bonds, sovereign as well as corporate. But we can see that it's reached over $4 trillion at the end of the third quarter last year. And the breakdown of that is on the right-hand side. And you see the large, kind of the largest portion of this is usually the green bonds. The social bonds and sustainability bonds, which are, again, kind of a mix of the green and social, are still are growing. But you see that kind of use of proceeds bonds, where the proceeds that of a transaction are specifically earmarked for projects, are still the predominant. The SLB is this very thin kind of orange line. It doesn't exist until 2021 when it was introduced, but you see it start to grow. And like I said, this is potentially an area which will grow more, in part because of some of the criticisms around use of proceeds bonds. Next slide, please. So, and this is just a snapshot of the global sovereign GSS plus capital markets. So we see on the left-hand side, again, the predominance of the green bonds. The little dots are the number of countries. So you see it kind of, again, you have kind of both in terms of volume of deals as well as number of countries issuing them. Those are still the kind of largest part of the market. Social bonds are small, but as we saw, kind of starting to grow. Sustainability, where those are being, the two are being mixed, is of an interest to issuers, to sovereign issuers, and the SLBs are just starting. That's shown in a different way in terms of volume on the right-hand side. But again, just 80% of that market is still the green bonds. And on this, I just wanted to look at more closely at the differences between a sustainability-linked bond and a use of proceeds bond. And through this slide, I think it'll become a little bit more clear also why the market might be, starting to look more seriously at sustainability-linked instruments, and why it might be of interest as well to issuers. First parameter is really the use of proceeds. As we've mentioned, for the SLB, it's free and clear. You can use the money as you wish. The real the promise or burden and responsibility is on the KPIs, but your you're left to use the proceeds as you see fit. Whereas in the use of proceeds bonds, you are restricted and you have promised to finance very specific projects. The sustainability objectives in both cases are defined, but in the SLB, they're defined as a specific list of measurable targets that must be achieved by certain predetermined dates. In the use of proceeds, those are in the bond frameworks and the intended allocation of the proceeds. Finance for sustainability measures, again, in the SLB, those can be gone through the general budget, whereas in the use of proceeds, it might be from a pre-specified account or by those amounts. Accountability, in both cases, you are going to have some level of verification and kind of monitoring, but in the case of the SLB, that is, of course, a lot more stringent because it is part of the bond documentation. And so you will have independent auditors providing legally binding second-party opinions on the success or failure of the sustainability initiatives. So that's really the kind of the heart, if you like, of those instruments. Whereas in the use of proceeds bonds, you're really just relying on the government to meet its promises made within the bond framework. To answer kind of an earlier question that was posed, in the use of proceeds types of bonds, there is no legal, say, default if you don't meet or don't use the proceeds in the way that you had intended. You might lose credibility with the market, but there are no financial consequences. Whereas in the sustainability linked instrument, there would be, which takes me to in the case of that SLB, you will see that the modification actually happens based on the performance of the indicators, as well as potentially including a higher cost of debt service or missed opportunity for saving if you fail to achieve the objectives. In the use of proceeds bonds, again, there is no financial consequence for not meeting your targets or even reneging on those promises. You'll lose credibility, but you won't lose actual, kind of finances. Requirements for issuance is in both cases a level of market access, but in the case of the SLB, you would also need a very high institutional capacity to coordinate the sustainability action across ministries, and you would need credible, independent, ideally international partners to assist with the monitoring, reporting, and verification. We can move to the next slide. Thank you. Sorry, that was heavily text, but hopefully helpful. Linking the conservation goals in an SLB, this is just to kind of highlight a little bit more what we mean by the KPIs. And this is really to kind of, if you think of moving from your nationally determined contribution, your NDC, to these types of bonds, this is how we would think about it. So, for example, a mitigation NDC could be to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So you could use that as a target to create specific KPIs, such as first, maybe a policy effectively implemented, and a second might be very linked to lowering those gases. Again, kind of as you get into the specific actions that would be taken in the KPI 1, you could enact legislation to cap annual industrial emissions of private companies by 2024, for instance. KPI 2 could be, for instance, very specifically reducing annual emissions by a certain percentage by a target date in either annual emissions or total emissions between, in a certain period to, again, a quantum of CO2. Adaptation could be done Also, these don't necessarily need to be around mitigation. You could, for instance, enhance water security by improving groundwater management. So you could have a third KPI around looking at your watershed ecosystem and expanding the area of protected watershed ecosystem by a certain percentage by, you know, a certain date. These are just examples, but just to kind of highlight a little bit how those KPIs translate into specific activities. Again, kind of looking at what the SLB would look like, you would have an issuance date where you would legally codify the KPIs and all of the contingent mechanisms around the financials. You would define a reference date by which the KPI would have to be met, or kind of when it would be assessed. And then depending on whether you had met or not met that KPI deadline, you could have the trigger date. So you would have a date at which the financial results of your KPI achievement or underachievement would take effect. And then that would stay in effect until maturity. So what do we mean about the financial effects? We've kind of mentioned it in passing, but this goes a little bit deeper in what we mean, what actually happens, you know, at that reference date when, or the trigger date, once you've assessed your KPI. So we have at the most simple level, a simple coupon step up. So in this case, if an issuer fails to meet the targets under a single KPI by the reference date, the coupon payments increase for the remaining tenor. So that's what we were just looking at. So that is one KPI assessed at a date, and then there is an effect, and the coupon would increase if you fail to meet your KPI. And then the rest are kind of building on that. So you could have multiple KPIs with coupon step ups. So each KPI might have its own reference date, and it would have its own coupon increase for failing to meet it. You could take a weighted approach with the coupon step up. So you could have a multiple KPIs with kind of different weights in terms of priority and importance. And you can look at that reference date and then decide and assess what the coupon effect would be on kind of either meeting or failing to meet those KPIs. You could have a tiered coupon step up, step down. I think you're getting a sense of that you can really get as creative as you want with your bankers and advisors on designing this, but you could have, in this case, multiple KPIs with each one with their own weights. And then the last two are a little bit different in the sense that you could have also built in a premium payment. So in other words, kind of a carrot rather than a stick. The first ones are all about penalties if you fail to meet. The last two are more carrots of saying, you know, if you achieve your target or overachieve your target, you could also build in that there's some sort of premium payment coming. Then those success payments could also be provided by a willing sponsor, such as an MDB or another development partner. So these are things that different issuers are looking at and trying to structure. So implementation of issuing an SLB instrument. The first, as we said, and this kind of mirrors the 7 steps that Paul had presented earlier. The first is really looking at frameworks. So you're, again, kind of in your interministerial task force with your advisors. It's really looking at establishing an SLB framework. And all of the decision-making process and research that has to go into that. Secondly, along the same lines is starting to set the actual targets. So working usually very closely alongside with NGOs, both local NGOs and international NGOs, leaning into the science, agreeing and defining ambitious sustainability performance targets, as well as key performance indicators. And I highlight the word ambitious because that is something definitely that creditors are looking for. They're not looking necessarily to just fund, business as usual. They're looking for coming in to helping governments really stretch for achievable but ambitious targets. The third step is really the financial terms. So establishing that coupon or financial adjustment mechanisms based on the performance. Those would include, as we said, either the step up coupons or even step down coupons, or these premium payments that we were highlighting on the previous slide. The fourth step is launching the transaction. And so that's working with financial partners such as investment banks, as well as your legal experts in drafting and underwriting all of the documentations and bringing the transaction to market. So hopefully raising new financing at a competitive cost. But I don't consider that the end of the transaction because I don't think that's where the hard work ends for you. It really keeps going, and that's achieving the goals. And that's both achieving your conservation objectives, but as well as your financial objectives. So that's really working in your at the cabinet level and through the technical levels on making those meeting those targets, but also working with second and third party opinion providers to provide that kind of verification and monitoring and reporting back to the market on your progress. And that ensures that systematic progress towards achieving your KPIs and SPTs. This is just a very quick kind of model, if you like, a little kind of picture of how this works. Looking at the left, you have your debt markets, your bondholders. In the middle, we have the sovereign issuer, and then we have the SPTs or the targets. So basically, the kind of the gold lines, if you like, at the top, the arrows. The debt markets obviously provide the bond proceeds. And in exchange, you are giving them the initial coupon payments of, let's just call it X%. But at the same time, you are looking and making allocations for achieving your SPTs. It's not a use of proceeds bonds, so those aren't necessarily going to be monitored in terms of how you're using the proceeds, but you do have to obviously invest in activities that will help you meet your SPTs. So we wanted to highlight that there. But depending on the success or failure of those KPIs, you will either have, in this case, we kind of did a step down or a step up. You could either, if you have achieved or overachieved your targets, you could have a lower coupon payment, or you could indeed have a higher coupon payment if those KPIs are not met. Yeah, I think if I'll defer to Tom and FCLP to say whether or not we want to kind of continue. I have lots of slides about case studies, but I can also pause here for questions because I know that we are on a time budget. And there may be lots of questions. This, what's on the screen at the moment, just to say, is just an example of Chile and their very successful program over many years of building credibility in the market, both first in the use of proceeds, green bond frameworks, then moving to a sustainable bond framework, and then kind of the boxes below show the issuances that were done in those years. And then they started really kind of looking at this SLB market. And so we saw the first successful sovereign SLB issuance in 2021. And then they came out with their SLB frameworks, which have been revised last year. But like I said, I can pause here and I'm happy to take questions.
Thanks, Jill. I would propose, yes, that we move on to the questions. That's very helpful given the time. But what I would suggest is we share these slides with your permission so people can see more of the case studies that you were going to go through. Mm-hmm. Maybe just to switch to the questions. I'm going to switch to the ones that are specifically more related to your presentation, Jill. I think, and then I'll come back to the other ones. So one from Angel Sandoval about, is there an example of social bonds that are currently implied?
Are there examples of social bonds?
Yes. Are you able to give an example of a social bond?
Yeah, one that pops immediately to mind that has been a very successful case, again, of kind of building that credibility in the market is Benin. It's a small country in West Africa, and they have really made a name for themselves through their frameworks. And they were working, I think it was with the UNDP, and developing a whole bond framework around, or SDG framework around the Sustainable Development Goals, and had been issuing both green bonds as well as social bonds, or what they call SDG bonds in their case. There are other cases, but I'm drawing a blank at the moment, but definitely the social bonds from sovereign issuers do exist.
Thank you. And moving quickly on, is there a country that originally made a loan claiming a kind of mitigation result based upon the conservation of nature? In other words, sort of linking an SLB that was linked to mitigation results that are from natural ecosystems, as in reducing deforestation or mangroves and protection of mangroves and so on.
Yes, the SLB market for sovereign issuers is still very, very small. We've only seen a few actual transactions happen in the bond market, right? In the loan market, there are a few more from sovereign issuers, but in the bond market, they're very small. We see them coming from Chile and Uruguay. And so in terms of specific with mangroves or a sustainability linked bond, I don't think so. There might be in the loan market, however. I can say that would be something generally that I think investors would be interested in, because as we know, mangroves are a very kind of important part of conservation and so those are well studied and well documented about the carbon capture.
Thank you. And then a final question that I'm not 100% sure I understand, but if you go back to the slide about the breakdown of the GSSS plus volumes in recent years, I assume the reason why that finishes in the Q1 to Q3 of 2023 is because there isn't yet data from after then. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, like I confessed, I was taking those graphs directly from the CBI paper. We would have to look on kind of updating those, for 2024. I don't believe they have a new paper coming out, but I can look into that. But yeah, that's the reason why that's ending at that date. We should obviously update those slides.
Because the slide obviously looks like the volumes are declining, after 2020, 3, but of course that the possibility there is that there is data that has yet to be captured, right? So actually the volumes are potentially increasing.
Right. And also I do want to highlight, and I tried to kind of touch upon it, but there was, you know, a moment when the markets were questioning the green bond or social bond kind of approach, the use of proceeds approach. And that's kind of precisely why I think that we will see, you know, the SLB type of approach kind of grow over the next years, because there is this concern in the green bond market about greenwashing, that, you know, sovereigns or issuers are borrowing this money and not necessarily having the impact that was intended. Where the SLB bond has a little bit more teeth to it, if you like. It puts a greater burden on performance than promises to do the right thing. It says, we don't, you know, to kind of put it really bluntly, we don't care so much about your promises, just show us the results. That's the approach of the SLB. And so I think you will see creditors kind of looking more and more towards, you know, very clear targets and measurable targets that can be verified by outside parties. And that brings me to another quick point, and I'll make it as quickly as possible, is, you know, about credit enhancement. And again, in the kind of debt swap area that Paul was covering, where we have the DFC or others, you know, IADB has been active in the space, where they've been willing to come in with guarantees or political risk insurance products that lower the cost of borrowing. Those entities also kind of prefer kind of looking at, you know, performance indicators that have a little bit more kind of ability to be verified.
It's really helpful. One final sort of quite technical question on this is going back to Chile's pathway, in that it issued green bonds and SDG bonds and so on. So would Uruguay's sort of logic of how they went about going about this and issuing the groups of SLBs, is that the sort of logic of flow that another country might want to follow?
Yeah, so Uruguay, like I said, we didn't get into the case studies, but, you know, Chile really kind of charted the path forward in this, as we say, kind of building from their experience of the green bonds and social bonds and moving into the SLB space and really showing how a sovereign could do it. Uruguay kind of looked at that, learned the lesson, and pushed the frameworks a little bit more by, instead of looking at just a step up coupon, that kind of stick approach, they looked at the carrot approach as well. So they have in their SLB also a step down coupon. So that really is exciting for the market. I think it's more interesting for sovereign issuers. Again, there's a lot of sovereigns who are looking at these types of bonds and financing options, of saying, how can we develop compelling KPIs, but also develop interesting financial rewards that can actually drive behavior. And so I think it is an interesting way. I think Uruguay was able to do that because of their very strong track record of conservation and programs. And so I think it really is country specific on what is the best path of building that credibility, both from a conservation standpoint as well as from a financial, you know, in the markets standpoint. But that's where you can work with, you know, a variety of both technical assistance from the MDBs or with the IMF, from the private sector, such as firms like myself, or NGOs.
That's very helpful. Switching to sort of more general questions, that there's one quite a bit of time ago about do experiences from debt swaps show positive impacts on forest conservation, as in, is there actually element of evidence of genuine outcomes that have been for forests that have been driven by these debt swapped instruments. I don't know, or SLBs actually, I don't know if you or Paul would like to take that question.
I'm happy to take a stab at it. You know, I think debt swaps, and again, to be really clear, debt swaps were introduced in 1987. They were bilateral debt swaps that were done primarily between well, a bilateral creditor and directly with the debtor country for specific programs. And I would dare to say that one of the most successful programs that was out there was from the United States, which was the Tropical Forest Conservation Act, which was then expanded to include also coral reefs, the TFCCA, as it is now known. And that was a highly successful program that brought in not only the US government through the US Treasury, but also USAID, and worked very closely with a variety of NGOs. Paul mentioned TNC, but also Conservation International, WWF, and others were involved in working with countries and developing those programs. And so there's a long and very rich and deep history of successful programs to support forests. In the kind of, if you say 21st century debt swaps, or kind of debt swaps 2.0, which we've seen more recently, using the markets and targeting bonded debt, those big transactions that we've seen so far in Belize, Ecuador, and Barbados were all around marine conservation. However, the deal that was done in Gabon is also incorporates some of their terrestrial forest issues, but kind of watch this space. There are more to come that will be looking at forests.
Wonderful. Do you want to add anything to that, Paul, or? Okay. Finally, on Moses' point, so there's obviously a lot of technical information here. The Secretariat will be sharing these materials and other learning materials around all the government partners here, so that you have all the information. And we're very happy to continue to convene spaces for lessons learned and exchanges among members, including bringing in colleagues from finance ministries, for example, to get into the details of this. So Moses, thank you for your point. And I think maybe feedback specifically to Silvana from the Secretariat about what sort of areas Nigeria would be interested in getting into in more detail. And then we can certainly pick that up and schedule for further sessions in due course. I don't know if there are any other last elements or last questions that people have, and I'm conscious that this has been a very quick overview, but wanted to extend massive thanks to Jill and to Paul for your insights and your expertise here and going through this with us. And also just a reminder to everybody that the next webinar will be held next Wednesday, September the 4th, where we will go deeper into case studies and specific examples, and we'll be joined by representatives from the governments of Ecuador, Belize, Brazil, and others to share their experiences and insights. So that will be a much more practical session focused on going through those case studies and specific country examples with representatives from those countries.